The blizzard had buried the ranch roads, frozen the barns, and left one question hanging in the mountain air. Why was the woman everyone ignored the only person who seemed ready? Snow slammed against the windows as Eleanor Whitman pushed through the storm with a lantern in one hand and a worn supply list in the other. The firewood was running low, the horses were restless, and the cowboys who once laughed at her warnings were now waiting for her next command. But how did the quiet ranch cook know what was coming before anyone else? Stay with us to discover the hidden strength behind Whispering Pines Ranch. Long before the first rider crossed the yard at Whispering Pines Ranch, before the coffee pot began to whistle, and before the cattle hands pulled on their boots, Eleanor Whitman was already awake. The old ranch house sat beneath the dark outline of the San Juan Mountains, surrounded by miles of frozen grass and pine-covered slopes. In the winter, the mornings came slowly there, the kind of slow where the sky stayed gray for what felt like hours, and every sound carried farther than it should. At 4:30 in the morning, the only lights burning at Whispering Pines came from the kitchen. Nora, as most people called her, stood beside the iron stove with a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders and flour dust on her hands. She moved quietly, almost like she was trying not to disturb the house itself. She had been doing that for years, making herself useful, making herself easy to overlook. The biscuits were already rising near the stove. A pot of coffee sat warming on the edge of the iron range. Salt pork was being prepared in the skillet, and a basket of eggs waited on the wooden counter. To anyone walking in at that moment, Nora Whitman was exactly what they expected her to be: the ranch cook, the woman who kept hungry cowboys fed, the woman who knew where every pan was stored and how much flour remained in the pantry. But Nora knew more than recipes. She always had. Before she poured the coffee, she stepped toward the back window and looked outside. The ranch was still sleeping. The bunkhouse was dark. The barn doors were closed. The horses stood quietly in their stalls, almost quietly. Nora narrowed her eyes. One of the horses, a brown mare named Daisy, was shifting her weight again and again. Not the restless movement of an animal waiting for breakfast. Something else. Nora grabbed her coat from the hook beside the door and stepped outside. The cold struck her immediately, her boots pressed into the thin layer of frost covering the porch steps. She pulled her shawl tighter and walked toward the barn. Daisy lifted her head when Nora entered. "Easy, girl," Nora whispered. She ran a hand along the mare's neck and listened. Animals spoke in ways people often forgot to understand. The horses knew when the weather changed. The cattle knew when the ground felt different. The mountains knew long before the people living beneath them did. Nora walked around the barn, checking the hinges, the roofline, and the wooden supports. One of the fence posts near the eastern pasture leaned slightly more than it had the day before. She stopped and studied it. The wood was soft near the base. Too soft. She touched it with her glove, then looked toward the mountains. The clouds were gathering above the peaks, not the thin winter clouds that passed through and disappeared. These were darker, heavier, the kind that carried weight. Nora stood there for a moment, silent beneath the cold morning sky. She had seen that kind of sky before, years ago, when she was still young and newly married. Back then, her husband Daniel had laughed when she told him a storm was coming. Not cruelly. He had simply believed what most men believed, that they understood the land because they worked it, but the land had its own language, and Nora had spent enough years listening. She returned to the kitchen and finished breakfast before the ranch began to wake. By 6 o'clock, boots started hitting the wooden floor. Men came in from the bunkhouse, rubbing their hands together, searching for warmth and coffee. Thomas Callahan entered last. He always did. At 43 years old, Tom Callahan carried himself like a man who had spent his whole life outdoors. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and quiet confidence. He was respected across the valley. He owned Whispering Pines Ranch because he had earned it. He knew cattle, He knew horses. He knew how to read a trail after a storm. But that morning, he did not notice the clouds. He did not notice Daisy's restless behavior. He did not notice the fence post near the eastern pasture. Nora noticed all of it. "Morning, Tom," she said. He nodded while removing his gloves. "Morning, Nora." That was how most of their conversations went, polite, respectful, short. He never treated her badly, but he rarely looked past the role she filled. She placed a plate of biscuits on the table. "Tom, can I speak with you a moment?" He looked up from pouring coffee. "Sure." Nora wiped her hands on her apron. "There may be a storm coming through the mountains." A few of the ranch hands nearby slowed their eating. Tom glanced toward the window. "You think so?" "I do. How soon?" "Hard to say. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow morning." She stepped closer. The temperature dropped faster than it should have overnight. The horses are unsettled, and those clouds over the western ridge. Tom listened. At least he listened. But after a moment, he gave the small smile. "Nora, this ranch has seen plenty of winter storms, I know. We've made it through worse." She looked at him. "I hope you're right." There was no anger in her voice, no frustration, just a simple statement. Tom took another drink of coffee. "I'll keep an eye on it." Nora nodded. She knew that meant the conversation was over. Around the table, the ranch hands returned to eating. Caleb Turner, the youngest of the crew, leaned back in his chair with a grin. "Guess we better listen to Nora. She knows storms better than she knows biscuits." A few men laughed, not because they meant harm, not because they wanted to hurt her. They laughed because they were comfortable, because they had never needed to take her warnings seriously. Nora picked up the empty coffee pot. She did not argue. She had learned something a long time ago. Some people only listened after the thing they ignored became impossible to deny. She returned to the kitchen. Behind the door, away from the noise of the dining room, she opened the pantry. Then she began counting: flour, beans, salt, canned goods, firewood. She checked the water barrels and moved a few supplies closer to the main house. Nobody asked why. Nobody noticed. That was fine. Nora Whitman had spent years being unnoticed. She knew how to work in silence. Outside, beyond the ranch fences, the clouds continued gathering over the San Juan Mountains, and while the cowboys of Whispering Pines Ranch prepared for another ordinary winter day, the woman behind the kitchen door was preparing for something else entirely. Nora Whitman spent the rest of the morning doing what she always did. She worked. The difference was that this time, every task had a purpose beyond keeping the ranch comfortable. After breakfast, the dining room emptied slowly. Boots scraped against the wooden floor. Chairs moved back. Coffee cups were left behind with small rings of brown liquid on the tables. The cowboys walked out into the cold with their coats pulled tight and their hats lowered against the wind. To them, it was just another winter morning. To Nora, it was a countdown. She carried the empty plates into the kitchen and washed them one by one. The warm waters steamed around her hands while she listened to the sounds outside: a gate opening, a horse calling, men shouting instructions across the yard. Normal sounds, but the wind had changed. She could feel it against the old kitchen windows. After finishing the dishes, Nora opened the pantry door and pulled out a small notebook she kept tucked behind the flour sacks. The cover was worn, the edges were soft from years of handling. Inside were numbers, not guesses, not worries. Numbers. How many sacks of flour remained? How much dried meat was stored? How many blankets were in the upstairs closet? How much firewood sat near the barn? Most people would never think about those things until they needed them. Nora had learned the hard way that by then it was usually too late. She added a note beside the supplies. "Need more lamp oil. Move extra blankets before evening." Then she closed the book. The sound of boots approaching the kitchen door made her look up. Thomas Callahan stood there. He had removed his hat, shaking a thin layer of frost from the brim. Nora. She turned. Tom. He glanced around the kitchen. He had been in that room thousands of times. He had eaten meals there. He had passed through to grab coffee before heading outside. But he rarely stopped, not until that morning. You moved some supplies? Nora looked toward the pantry. Just a few things. Why? She dried her hands. Because I think we may need them. Tom leaned against the doorframe. Not annoyed. Not angry. Just uncertain. Nora, the men are saying the same thing you said earlier. Storm coming. They should listen. They will. She held his eyes. Will they? For a moment, neither of them spoke. Tom was a good man. Nora knew that. He paid his workers fairly. He helped neighbors when cattle wandered onto the wrong land. He had carried more responsibility than most men his age. But sometimes a person could be good and still fail to notice what was right in front of them. I just don't want the ranch making decisions based on fear, Tom finally said. Nora looked down at the notebook still sitting on the counter. This isn't fear. She tapped the cover lightly. This is preparation. Tom followed her gaze. What exactly are you preparing for? She hesitated, not because she did not know, because she knew how it sounded. A ranch cook telling the owner of Whispering Pines Ranch that she understood his land better than he did. I think this storm could be worse than people expect. Tom watched her carefully. You've been through one like this before? Nora nodded. More than one. Where? Wyoming. Idaho. He waited. She did not explain further. Tom seemed to notice that. For a second, his expression softened, but then he looked back toward the yard. We'll be careful. It was the same answer. Different words, same meaning. Nora lowered her eyes. All right. Tom put his hat back on. At the doorway, he stopped. Nora. She looked up. Thank you for looking after the place. The words were kind, but they were not the words she needed, because looking after the place was exactly what she had been doing. The question was whether anyone would listen when she said the place was in danger. After Tom left, Nora stood quietly in the kitchen, then she turned back to work. By noon, the temperature had dropped enough that the water buckets outside had a thin layer of ice across the surface. The mountain wind pushed harder. The ranch hands noticed, but not enough. Caleb Turner came through the kitchen looking for coffee. He was 25, strong, confident, and still young enough to believe experience belonged only to people who looked like they had earned it. He poured himself a cup and looked out the window. Clouds are getting ugly. Nora glanced over. They are, Caleb smiled. You still thinking we're about to get buried? Nora did not answer immediately. She stirred the stew pot on the stove. I think people should pay attention. Caleb leaned against the counter. My father used to say women could predict weather better than men because they were always looking for something to complain about. He laughed at his own joke. Nora looked at him, not angrily, not hurt, just quietly. Caleb's smile faded a little. He realized she was not laughing with him. Sorry, Miss Nora. Didn't mean anything by it, I know. And that was the strange thing. She did know. Most people who ignored her did not mean to be cruel. They simply never considered that someone like her might know something worth hearing. Caleb finished his coffee and nodded toward the door. I'll tell the boys to check the fence. Thank you. When he left, Nora watched him cross the yard. At least one person had looked. That mattered. The afternoon passed with the strange stillness that comes before a major storm. The cattle were restless. The horses kicked at their stalls. Even the ranch dogs refused to settle. Nora walked the property again. She checked the barn. She checked the storage shed. She checked the eastern pasture fence. The leaning post was worse. She pressed her glove against it. The wood gave slightly. Nora looked toward the mountains. The clouds were no longer gathering. They were coming. She returned to the house before sunset. Inside the kitchen, she began moving supplies closer to where they would be needed. Extra blankets near the fireplace, water containers near the stove, a stack of dried food where it could be reached quickly. She did not hide what she was doing, but nobody asked. That was almost worse. At supper, the men filled the dining room again, the same table, the same chairs, the same warm food. But the conversation had changed. The wind outside was louder now. Caleb looked toward the window. Cold tonight, Sam Foster, the oldest ranch hand, sat quietly at the end of the table. At 67, Sam had spent most of his life around cattle and mountains. He did not speak often, but when he did, people usually listened. He looked at Nora. "You still think it's coming?" She met his eyes. "Yes," Sam nodded slowly. No joke, no smile, just a simple acceptance. Tom noticed. "You believe her?" Sam took a drink of coffee. "I believe she notices things." The room became quieter for a moment. Tom looked at Sam, then at Nora. It was the first time all day someone had said it out loud. Not that Nora was right. Not yet. Just that she was worth listening to. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the ranch house. The old wooden walls creaked. Nora stood near the kitchen doorway and watched the men continue eating. They still did not understand. Not yet, but the mountains had already begun changing. And soon, Whispering Pines Ranch would learn that the quiet woman carrying plates through the dining room had been paying attention to a danger nobody else could see. The morning after Nora's warning arrived colder than anyone expected. The kind of cold that made the wooden steps outside the ranch house crack beneath a person's boots. The kind that turned every breath into a small cloud before disappearing into the gray air. Thomas Callahan noticed the temperature first. He stood beside the barn with his coat pulled tight, watching the ranch hands saddle the horses. "Feels like it's dropping fast," Caleb Turner said. Tom glanced toward the mountains. The peaks were covered by a heavy layer of clouds. Not snow yet, not quite, but close. "We'll finish the eastern pasture check before noon," Tom said. Caleb nodded and tightened the strap on his saddle. Sam Foster stood nearby, saying nothing. The old ranch hand had been watching the sky longer than any of them had been alive. He did not make predictions often. He did not waste words, but he looked toward the mountains the same way Nora had. That caught Tom's attention. "You see something?" Sam adjusted his gloves, just looking. Tom waited. Sam looked back at him. "Sometimes that's enough." Tom did not answer. He understood the meaning, but he did not know what to do with it. Running a ranch meant making decisions, every day, every hour. If you stopped every time something felt unusual, you would never get anything done. That was what Tom told himself. By late morning, the first flakes appeared, small, thin, almost beautiful. The ranch hands noticed, but nobody worried. Winter in Colorado meant snow. Snow was part of life. The cattle knew it. The horses knew it. The people knew it. At least, they thought they did. Inside the ranch house, Nora watched the snow through the kitchen window while she kneaded bread dough. Her hands moved steadily, but her eyes kept returning to the mountains. The snowfall was too early, too thick, too quiet. She wiped flour from her fingers and walked to the back door. The wind had shifted. That was the part that bothered her. The snow was not coming down from the direction it should. It was coming over the higher ridges. A mountain storm, the kind that could trap a person before they realized they were trapped. Nora stepped outside and looked toward the barn. Tom was there. She found him near the cattle records, studying a small leather notebook. "Tom." He looked up. "Everything all right?" Nora walked closer. "We need to move the cattle." Tom frowned slightly. "Now, yes, because of the snow, because of what comes after it." He closed the notebook. "Nora, heard the hesitation in his voice, not anger, not impatience, something else. A man trying to be polite while disagreeing. "The eastern pasture is too exposed," she said. "The lower ground will collect snow. If the wind changes tonight, the cattle won't have enough shelter." Tom looked toward the pasture. "We planned that area because the grass is still good." "I know, and moving them now means losing a day of work." Nora held his gaze. "A lost day is better than lost cattle." The words hung between them. For a moment, Tom did not respond. Then he looked away. "I appreciate your concern." There it was again, the same careful kindness, the same distance. Nora knew that tone. It was the tone people used when they had already decided not to follow your advice but wanted you to feel respected anyway. "Tom." He looked back. "Please." Something in her voice made him pause, not fear, not pleading, just certainty. But after a long moment, he shook his head. "We've got men watching the weather. We'll make adjustments if we need to." Nora looked at him quietly. "All right." She turned away. Tom watched her walk back toward the house. For reasons he could not explain, the sight bothered him, not because she was angry. She wasn't. That almost made it worse. She simply accepted that he would not listen. And somehow, that felt heavier. By afternoon, the snow began falling harder. The ranch changed. The mountains disappeared behind a curtain of white. The road leading toward Redstone became difficult to see. The men worked faster. Gates were checked. Horses were brought closer to the barn. Extra hay was moved, but the eastern pasture remained untouched. The cattle stayed where Tom had planned. Nora saw them from the kitchen window. She watched the herd moving slowly through the snow. She watched the dark clouds swallowing the mountains. Then she opened her supply notebook again. She added another line, "Need to prepare for 2 days minimum." She did not write it because she was worried. She wrote it because she knew. At supper, the dining room was quieter than usual. The men were tired. Snow tapped against the windows. The stove burned hot. For a moment it felt almost peaceful. Caleb took a bite of stew and looked toward the window. Suppose Nora was right. A few men looked up. Caleb shrugged. "I said suppose." One of the ranch hands laughed. "Then she'll have to tell the storm where to go." A few men chuckled. Nora stood near the kitchen counter, pouring coffee. She heard them. She always heard them. But she said nothing. Sam looked at her. His expression changed slightly. He understood. After supper, when the others left, Sam stayed behind. Nora was wiping the table. "You knew," he said. She looked up. "Knew what? That it would get worse." Nora folded the cloth. "I knew it might." Sam nodded. "Tom?" She looked toward the window. "He'll do what he thinks is right." The old cowboy studied her. "You always talk like that? Like what? Like you're defending people who don't listen to you." Nora was quiet. Then she smiled faintly. "I suppose I am." Sam looked at the snow outside. "You shouldn't have to." She did not answer, because she had spent too many years learning not to expect fairness from the world. Later that night, the storm truly arrived. The wind came first. It pushed against the ranch house with a deep, steady force. The windows rattled. The horses began calling from the barn. Tom woke up. He sat up in his room and listened. Something about the sound outside felt different, not like an ordinary snowstorm, like something larger, something moving down from the mountains. He walked to the window. The ranch disappeared into darkness and blowing snow. For the first time, he thought about Nora standing in the kitchen that morning, the way she had looked at him. Not scared, not uncertain, just sure. Outside, the storm grew stronger, and somewhere beyond the barn, in the eastern pasture, dozens of cattle stood beneath a sky that had already made its decision. By sunrise, Whispering Pines Ranch would no longer be asking whether Nora Whitman was right. It would be asking whether they had enough time left to listen. The morning came without a sunrise. The mountains that usually stood clear beyond the valley were gone behind a wall of snow and wind. The sky had disappeared into one endless sheet of gray, and the world outside the ranch house looked smaller than it had the day before, the kind of small that made a person understand how far away help really was. Tom Callahan woke before the alarm bell in the bunkhouse could ring. He knew something was wrong before he even stepped out of bed. The storm had a different sound. Not the gentle tapping of snow against the windows, not the ordinary winter wind that passed through the valley and moved on. This wind pushed. It pressed against the walls of the house like it was searching for every weakness. Tom dressed quickly and walked downstairs. The kitchen was already warm. Of course it was. Nora stood beside the stove, pouring coffee into a tin cup. She looked tired, not frightened, just tired. Tom stopped in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nora handed him the coffee. "You were right about one thing," she said. Tom looked at her. "What?" "We needed to watch the weather." He lowered his eyes. The words were gentle. That somehow made them harder to hear. "I should have moved the cattle." Nora did not answer immediately. She looked toward the window. Outside, snow covered the yard. The path to the barn was already nearly gone. "It's not about yesterday anymore," she said. Tom followed her gaze. No. She turned back toward him. "It's about what we do now." That was the first thing Nora said that morning that sounded like an order. Not a suggestion, not a warning, an instruction. And Tom noticed. He did not say anything, but he noticed. A loud crash came from outside. Both of them turned. A few seconds later, Caleb burst through the kitchen door, snow covering his shoulders. "The north side of the barn roof is taking weight," he said, breathing hard. "Sam sent me." Tom immediately stood. "How bad?" "Bad enough that we need men on it before it gives." Tom grabbed his coat, then he stopped, because through the kitchen window, he saw something else, the eastern pasture, or where the eastern pasture should have been. The fence line was almost invisible. The cattle were moving together, crowded against the wind, too far from shelter, too exposed. His jaw tightened. Nora saw his expression. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not need to. That was the part Tom remembered later. She never once made him feel smaller for being wrong. She only cared about what needed to happen next. "We have to get them to the lower valley," Nora said. Tom looked at her, the trail still passable for a little while. "Little while?" She looked toward the window until the snow covers it completely. Tom was silent. Then he turned to Caleb. "Get Sam. Get every man you can find." Caleb nodded and ran back outside. Within minutes, the ranch changed. The quiet panic of uncertainty became movement. Men pulled on coats, horses were saddled, ropes were gathered. The storm continued pounding the ranch, but now everyone was moving. Nora stood near the kitchen door, watching. Tom walked past her, then stopped. "Nora," she looked up. He hesitated. It was only a second. But she noticed. She noticed everything. "What?" He looked toward the storm, then back at her. "If we get the cattle through, where do they go?" She answered immediately. "The narrow valley east of the old Pine Ridge." Tom frowned slightly. "That area doesn't have much grass." "No." "Then why?" "Because the trees break the wind. The ground rises enough to avoid the deepest snow. The cattle can survive there." Tom studied her face. "How do you know that?" Nora looked down briefly. "Because I walked it." "When?" "Last month." Tom stared. "You walked the East Ridge alone?" "I was checking the land." He almost said something. She saw it. The concern, the question, the thought that maybe he should have known. But he stopped himself. That was different, small, almost invisible, but different. "All right," he said. and then he walked outside. Nora stood still for a moment, not because of what he said, because of what he did not say. He did not dismiss her. He did not smile politely. He listened. Outside, the ranch hands fought the storm. The cattle moved slowly. The wind pushed against them. The mountains disappeared completely. Sam rode beside Tom, his old face wrapped in a wool scarf. "You finally asked her?" Tom looked over. "Asked who?" Sam gave him a look. Tom knew exactly who. He looked ahead. "She knows the land." Sam nodded. "She does." A pause. "How long have you known?" Sam looked toward the ranch house. "Long enough." Tom frowned. "Why didn't you say something?" Sam gave a small shrug. "Nobody asked." Those 3 words stayed with Tom. Nobody asked. The cattle reached the lower valley just before the worst of the afternoon wind arrived. It was not easy. Nothing about that day was easy, but Nora had been right. The trees gave them shelter. The higher ground protected them. The cattle settled. And for the first time since morning, Tom felt like they had gained a little ground against the storm. When he returned to the ranch, the situation inside had changed. The barn was worse. The roof supports were bending under the snow. 2 horses needed to be moved. The water pump had frozen, and the road to Redstone was no longer a road. It was just white. Gone. Tom walked into the kitchen and found Nora filling buckets. She looked up. The pump? Frozen. I expected that. Tom almost smiled. "Almost. You expected everything?" Nora looked at him. "No." She handed him a bucket, just enough to keep us from being surprised. That answer stayed with him because it sounded exactly like her. Not dramatic, not proud, just practical. As evening arrived, the storm grew stronger. The ranch became a world of its own. 14 people, a handful of horses, dozens of cattle, and one woman who had spent days preparing for a disaster nobody believed would come. The men gathered near the fireplace that night. They were tired, cold, quiet. Caleb looked at Nora as she entered with more coffee. The young cowboy who had joked about her weather predictions days earlier lowered his eyes. "Miss Nora." She stopped. "Yes?" He looked uncomfortable, like he was searching for words he had never needed before. "I should have listened." Nora held his gaze, then she handed him the coffee cup. "Drink before it gets cold." That was all she said, but Caleb nodded, and this time he meant it. Later that night, when everyone thought the worst of the work was done, Tom walked outside one more time. He stood beneath the storm and looked at the ranch. The place he had spent his life building, the place he believed he understood. Then he looked back toward the kitchen window. The light was still on. Nora was inside, still working, still preparing, still carrying the weight of a ranch that had barely noticed she was carrying anything at all. And for the first time, Tom Callahan wondered something he had never allowed himself to wonder before. How many times had Nora Whitman been right while everyone else was too busy to listen? The storm answered for him, because somewhere beyond the snow-covered hills, the mountain roads disappeared completely. Whispering Pines Ranch was alone, and now every person inside it depended on the woman they had spent years looking past. The storm did not care who owned the ranch. It did not care who had experience, who carried the biggest responsibilities, or who sat at the head of the dinner table. The wind came through the mountains the same way it always had, without permission, without apology. By the second night, Whispering Pines Ranch had become a place measured by small things: the amount of firewood beside the stove, the number of lanterns still burning, the warmth left in each room, the strength of every person trying to stay awake. Nora Whitman moved through the ranch house quietly, carrying a kettle of hot water from room to room. She had tied her hair back with a simple ribbon. Her dress was covered by an old wool apron. Her boots were damp from walking between the house and the barn. She looked exactly like the woman everyone had always seen. The cook, the housekeeper, the person who made sure everyone else had what they needed. But now every person in the room watched when she entered. Not because she demanded attention, because they were waiting. That was the strange part. Nora had spent years wishing people would hear her. Now they were listening, and she almost did not know what to do with that. Near midnight, a loud crack came from the barn. Every man in the main room stood at once. Tom grabbed his coat. "I'll check it." Nora stepped forward. "Take Sam and Caleb with you." Tom looked at her, not past her, at her. "Why? The western support beam is older. The wind is hitting that side harder." Tom paused. Then he nodded. "Sam, Caleb, with me." 3 men left. The others stayed near the fireplace. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then one of the younger ranch hands looked toward Nora. "How did you know about the cattle?" Nora turned from the stove. "What? The valley?" He rubbed his hands together. "You knew those trees would protect them." Nora looked down at the cup she was filling. "I walked the land." The man nodded slowly, like he was realizing something. She had not been guessing. She had been studying. A little while later, the door opened. Cold air rushed inside. Tom entered first. Snow covered his shoulders. The expression on his face had changed. The confident certainty he usually carried was gone, not replaced by weakness, something else. "Respect. The barn is holding," he said. A few men let out quiet breaths. Caleb found the loose section before it became a problem. Caleb looked embarrassed by the attention. "I just followed what Nora said." The room went quiet, because everyone heard it, not what Tom said, not what the ranch plan was, what Nora said. Tom removed his gloves and looked around. "We need to move the spare tools closer to the house." Nora looked at him. "They're already there." Tom stopped. "Already?" She nodded. "Yesterday afternoon." He stared at her. "You moved them yesterday?" "Yes. Why didn't you tell me?" Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she answered honestly. "I tried." The words were quiet, but they landed. Tom looked away. There was no argument he could make, no explanation, because she was right. He had heard her. He just had not listened. The storm continued through the night. The next morning brought no relief. The road to Redstone was buried. The telegraph line was down. The ranch was cut off, and every decision mattered. Tom stood near the kitchen table with a rough map spread out in front of him. Sam stood beside him. Caleb leaned against the wall. Several ranch hands gathered around. Nora entered carrying coffee. Nobody moved away. That alone felt different. Tom looked up. "Nora," she stopped. "Yes?" He hesitated. It was a small thing. A man like Tom Callahan was not used to hesitating. "I need your help." The kitchen became quiet. Nora looked at him. Not because she was surprised he needed help, because of the way he said it. Not like a favor, not like an order, like an honest request. "What do you need?" Tom pointed to the map. "The cattle are safe for now, but we need to make sure they stay that way." Nora stepped closer. She studied the paper. "The North Trail won't work." Tom looked at her. "Why? Snow will collect there against the ridge." She moved her finger across the map. "The old logging path is better." Sam nodded slowly. "I was thinking the same." Tom looked at him, then back at Nora. "How many men? 4. Who?" Nora thought for a moment. "Sam, Caleb, Miguel, and you." Tom raised an eyebrow. "And you?" She looked toward the kitchen. "I have work here." The answer surprised him. Not because she refused, because she did not need recognition. She simply knew where she was needed. Tom nodded. "All right." The 4 men prepared, and this time nobody questioned Nora's instructions, not one person. The old logging path was exactly as she predicted. The snow was deeper in places, but the trees broke the wind. The cattle moved safely. The ranch hands returned hours later with a different kind of silence. Not the silence of doubt, the silence of people who had seen something they could not ignore anymore. That evening, the men gathered around the fire. Caleb sat quietly, turning his coffee mug between his hands. Finally, he looked toward Nora. "Miss Nora?" She glanced over. "Yes, I owe you an apology." The room became still. Caleb swallowed. "I thought you were just trying to scare everybody." Nora said nothing. "I was wrong." She studied him for a moment, then she nodded. "Thank you for saying it, that was all. No lecture, no reminder, just acceptance." Later, when most of the men had gone to rest, Tom remained in the kitchen. Nora was cleaning the last dishes. "You should sleep," he said. She looked over her shoulder. "So should you." A faint smile crossed his face. "I suppose that's fair." The fire popped softly. Outside, the storm still covered the mountains. Inside, the ranch felt different. Tom stepped closer to the table. "I've worked this land for 20 years. Nora dried a plate. "I know. I thought I understood every part of it." She looked at him. "And now?" Tom glanced around the kitchen, at the supplies, the organized shelves, the notes she had written, the things she had quietly done while everyone else was busy ignoring her. "Now I think maybe I only understood the parts I was willing to see." Nora did not answer. She did not know what to do with words like that. People had apologized before. Sometimes they meant it, sometimes they forgot. So she simply placed the plate away and returned to the counter. Tom watched her for a moment. Then he picked up the stack of clean cups beside her. Without saying anything, he began drying them. Nora noticed. Of course she did. She noticed everything. The storm outside continued. But inside Whispering Pines Ranch, something else had changed. For the first time, the woman behind the kitchen door was no longer standing alone. And the man who owned the ranch was finally beginning to understand that the person who knew how to save it had been there all along. But the storm had not finished testing Whispering Pines Ranch. The mountains remained buried beneath a thick blanket of snow. The familiar trails between the barns and the house had disappeared. Fence posts stood like dark shadows against the white landscape, and the wind pushed against the walls of every building, as if searching for a way inside. The ranch survived 1 hour at a time. Morning came without sunlight, the sky stayed gray, and the cold settled deeper. Nora Whitman stood beside the kitchen window, holding a chipped blue mug filled with coffee. She watched the snow move across the yard. A year ago, nobody would have noticed her standing there. Nobody would have wondered what she was thinking. Now Tom Callahan noticed. He was sitting at the kitchen table, looking over the supply notes she had written in a small leather-bound book. The pages were filled with careful handwriting: flour, beans, coal, lamp oil, animal feed, even small things like extra blankets and medicine. Tom ran his finger down one page. "You kept records of everything?" Nora turned from the window. "Someone had to." He looked at her. There was no bitterness in her voice. That was the part that bothered him most. She was not angry. She had simply carried the responsibility quietly, for years. Tom closed the book. "I should have known." Nora placed the coffee pot back on the stove. "Most people don't notice things they think don't matter." The words were simple, but Tom felt them. Before he could answer, the kitchen door opened. Sam Foster stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. Tom stood. "What happened?" Sam removed his gloves. "One of the horses is injured. Nothing serious, but she won't put weight on her front leg." Tom reached for his coat. "I'll get Doc Miller." Nora looked toward the window. "The road won't be open." Tom stopped. The room went quiet. She continued. "The snow drift near the lower ridge is too deep. Even if someone makes it halfway, they won't reach Redstone before dark." Tom looked at Sam. The older ranch hand slowly nodded. She's right. Tom looked back at Nora. What do we do? It was the first time he had asked her that question, without hesitation. Nora walked toward the shelf and picked up a small wooden box. Bring the horse to the warm stall. Caleb, who had been standing near the doorway, looked surprised. The warm stall, the old storage shed beside the barn. Caleb frowned. That's been empty for years. Nora opened the box. I cleaned it 2 weeks ago. Tom looked at her. 2 weeks? She nodded. Before the storm. Inside the box were clean cloths, a bottle of medicine, and several small tools. Nothing fancy, nothing unusual, just prepared. Sam let out a quiet breath. She had the whole ranch ready before we even knew we needed it. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned it. The same men who once teased her about worrying too much now moved exactly when she spoke. And Nora noticed that too. She noticed everything. The horse was brought inside before the cold could worsen the injury. The men worked together. They carried water. They repaired small breaks in the barn. They checked the cattle. And through it all, Nora moved between them, not like someone giving orders, like someone who had always been part of the work. Late that afternoon, Tom found her in the barn. She was standing beside the injured horse, gently checking the bandage. Snow tapped against the wooden roof. The sound filled the silence between them. You should rest, Tom said. Nora did not look up. So should you. I own the ranch. She glanced at him, and I cook for it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Tom smiled slightly. It was the first time Nora had seen him smile during the storm. Not the polite smile he gave guests, not the confident smile he wore when negotiating cattle prices. A real one. You always have an answer. Usually. That surprised a quiet laugh from him. The sound felt strange in the frozen barn, almost warm. Tom stepped closer. Why didn't you leave? Nora's hand stopped. The question hung in the air. She looked back at the horse. Leave where? Tom did not have an answer, because he knew. The frontier was full of people who talked about starting over. But starting over was easier said than done. Nora had already lost a husband. She had already lost the life she thought she would have. Whispering Pines was not just a place where she worked. It was the last piece of a world she had built. Tom lowered his voice. I mean, after your husband died. Nora became still. The wind moved around the barn walls. My husband was a good man, she said. Tom waited. He taught me things most people thought women shouldn't know. She looked at the cattle beyond the stall. How to read the land. How to keep records. How to tell when an animal was in trouble. How to prepare before something went wrong. A pause. After he was gone, I kept doing those things. Tom looked at her carefully, and nobody asked. Nora's eyes met his. That one word carried years. Tom looked down. For a man who had faced angry bulls, harsh winters, and difficult business deals, he suddenly seemed unsure what to say. I'm sorry. Nora did not immediately answer. She looked at him. Not because she doubted him, because she was trying to understand whether those words would stay after the storm ended. Finally, she nodded. Thank you. That night the blizzard became worse. The wind shook the windows of the ranch house. The men gathered near the fire, wrapped in heavy coats and blankets. Nobody complained. Nobody joked. They were tired. They were scared. But they were together. Nora walked in carrying a large pot of stew. The room became quiet, not because they were waiting for food, because they were waiting for her. Caleb moved his chair. Miss Nora, sit down. She looked surprised. I still have things to do. Sam shook his head. Not tonight. She looked around. Every man in the room was watching her, not as the person who served them, as someone who belonged there. Slowly, Nora sat. Tom placed a bowl in front of her before taking one himself. A small gesture, almost nothing. But Nora noticed. Of course she did. The storm raged outside. The mountains were still closed. The ranch was still trapped. But inside that small room, something that had been frozen for years had finally begun to thaw. Later, when everyone had gone to sleep, Tom found Nora sitting alone near the dying fire. "You should rest," he said. She smiled faintly. "You already said that, and you ignored me. So did you." Tom sat across from her. For a while they listened to the wind. Then he asked quietly, "Why did you keep helping people who never saw you?" Nora looked into the fire. Her answer came after a long silence, because the work still mattered. Tom lowered his eyes. The fire cracked softly between them, and for the first time in many years, Nora Whitman did not feel invisible, not because people finally praised her, not because they suddenly understood everything, but because one man had finally stopped looking at the role she filled and started seeing the woman who had been there all along. The morning after the blizzard arrived quietly, no howling wind, no shaking windows, no snow racing across the ground like a white river. Just silence. The kind of silence that made people step outside carefully, as if the mountains themselves were still deciding whether they were safe. Whispering Pines Ranch stood beneath a pale winter sky. The barns were covered in snow. The fences disappeared in places beneath deep drifts. The old wooden sign above the ranch gate hung crooked, held in place by only one rusted chain. But it was still there. The ranch was still there. Tom Callahan stepped outside before sunrise. He pulled his coat tighter and looked across the property. For 3 days, he had wondered if he would see this morning. He had seen storms before. He had watched cattle disappear into heavy snow. He had ridden through freezing rain. But this had been different. This storm had not cared how experienced a man was. It had not cared who owned the land. It had not cared who carried the title of ranch owner. It had simply come. And when it came, the person who kept Whispering Pines alive was the woman everyone had walked past every day. Tom heard footsteps behind him. Sam Foster came out carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one over. "Didn't think you'd sleep much." Tom accepted the cup. "Didn't." Sam looked toward the house. Neither did she. Tom followed his eyes. Through the kitchen window, he could see Nora moving around inside. She was already working, even after everything. Even after spending nights awake checking supplies and caring for everyone. She was still making breakfast. Tom watched for a moment. Then he looked down at his coffee. She shouldn't have to be the first one awake anymore. Sam gave him a sideways glance. "That's something you should have figured out years ago." Tom did not argue, because Sam was right. Inside this kitchen, Nora placed fresh biscuits onto a wooden tray. The room looked exactly the same as it always had. The iron stove, the shelves filled with jars, the old table where ranch hands ate every morning. But somehow it felt different, maybe because Nora felt different, or maybe because people were finally paying attention. When Caleb entered, he stopped near the doorway. For once, he did not make a joke. He removed his hat. "Morning, Miss Nora." Nora looked up. "Morning, Caleb." He stood there awkwardly. The young cowboy who once laughed when she mentioned the weather suddenly seemed to have forgotten how to speak. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I wanted to say," Nora waited. Caleb looked down. "I was wrong." The kitchen became quiet. Nora set down the spoon in her hand. "About what?" He gave a small embarrassed smile. "About a lot." For the first time, Nora smiled at him. Not a large smile. Just enough. "That's a good place to start." Caleb nodded. Then he took the tray of biscuits from the counter. "I'll carry these." Nora looked surprised. "You don't have to, I know." That answer made her pause, because it was the first time someone helped her without acting like it was a favor. A few minutes later, the dining room filled again, but this morning was different. Men who once spoke over Nora now waited for her to finish speaking. Men who once ignored her warnings now asked questions. What do you think about the south pasture? Do you think the supplies will last? Should we repair the east fence first? Small questions, simple questions, but they meant something. Tom noticed everyone, and he noticed something else. Nora did not celebrate. She did not remind them that she had been right. She did not mention every time they had dismissed her. She simply answered. Because Nora Whitman had never needed to prove she was capable. She had only needed someone willing to listen. Later that morning, Tom found her in the office. The room was small, with a wooden desk near the window. Old receipts sat in a neat stack beside a ledger. Tom looked around. You keep all the ranch records? Nora nodded. Most of them. Most? She opened a drawer. Inside were years of papers, cattle purchases, feed deliveries, repair costs, weather notes. Tom picked up a small folder. These are from before I bought the ranch. Nora nodded. My husband helped the previous owner keep records. Tom looked at the handwriting. Your handwriting? No. She touched the paper lightly. The room became still. Tom placed the folder down carefully. I didn't know. I know. There was no anger. That almost made it harder. Tom leaned against the desk. How many times did you try to tell me things? Nora looked toward the window. Snow fell from the roof in small pieces. I stopped counting. The words stayed with him before he could answer. The sound of a horse came from outside. Sam entered a moment later. Tom. Tom turned. What happened? Sam removed his gloves. Ranch over near Black Creek lost 2 barns. The family made it through, but they need help. Tom immediately reached for his coat. We'll send men. Nora looked at the map on the desk. Which ranch? Sam told her. Nora studied their location, then she pointed. They'll need more than lumber. Tom stepped closer. What do you mean? Their lower field floods when the snow melts. If the creek is blocked by ice, they could lose the whole pasture. Sam looked at her. You know that area? I passed through it years ago. Tom looked at the map. She was right, again. He slowly folded the paper. Then we go there. Nora looked up. You're going? Tom nodded. We're going. A small pause. The word mattered. Not because he was including her as an employee, but because he was including her as someone whose judgment belonged beside his. That afternoon, Tom and Nora rode out with Sam toward the neighboring ranches. The landscape was changed. The trails were buried. The mountains looked taller beneath the snow. The same wilderness that had trapped them now showed the damage left behind. Broken fences, collapsed sheds, empty feed storage. Whispering pines had survived. Others had not been as fortunate. When they reached the first ranch, an older woman opened the door of a small cabin. Her eyes widened when she saw Nora. You're from Whispering Pines? Nora nodded. The woman looked past her toward Tom, then back at Nora. You were the one who prepared your ranch. Nora did not answer. She simply handed over a list of supplies. We brought what we could. The woman took the paper. Her hands trembled slightly. Thank you. As they helped unload supplies, Tom watched. Nobody introduced Nora as the cook. Nobody asked her to stand aside. People listened. They followed her suggestions. They trusted her. And Tom realized something. The storm had not created Nora's strength. It had only removed the chance for people to ignore it. On the ride home, the sun began dropping behind the mountains. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Tom said quietly, You know what bothers me? Nora looked over. What? He held the reins loosely. That I thought I knew this ranch. She waited, and I didn't. Nora looked ahead at the snow-covered trail. Most people only see what they expect to see. Tom glanced at her. And what did I expect to see? She was quiet for a moment. Then she answered, "A woman who cooked meals." The words were not cruel. That made them harder to hear. Tom looked away, because she was right. When they reached the ranch gate, the last light of day touched the mountains. The storm had passed. But something else had begun. And neither Tom nor Nora knew yet that the hardest fight for Whispering Pines had not been against the snow. It was waiting just beyond the mountains. The first sign came 3 days after the storm cleared. A black carriage appeared on the road leading into Redstone Valley. The wheels rolled slowly through the remaining snow, leaving deep tracks behind. The driver wore a heavy wool coat, and beside him sat a man with polished boots, a clean collar, and a dark hat that looked untouched by the harsh frontier weather. He did not look like a man who had fought the storm. He looked like a man who had been waiting for it to end. His name was Victor Langley, and in the weeks after the blizzard, nearly every rancher in the valley would hear it. Victor stepped down from the carriage outside the Redstone trading post. The town was still recovering. The wooden sidewalks were covered in patches of ice. The blacksmith shop stayed busy from sunrise to sunset, repairing broken tools and wagon parts. The small diner near Main Street served more coffee than usual because ranchers had nowhere else to sit and talk. Everyone had a story about the storm. Everyone had something they lost. A barn, a fence line, a herd of cattle, a season of work. Victor listened to every story, but he did not listen like a neighbor. He listened like a man counting numbers. At the trading post, he unfolded a map across the counter. The owner, Henry Wallace, looked down at it. "You've been busy," Victor smiled. "Opportunity doesn't wait for people to recover." Henry frowned. "Some folks around here are trying to rebuild." Victor folded the map carefully. "Some folks around here won't have enough money to rebuild." He left the words hanging. That was how Victor Langley worked. He never forced a door open. He waited until someone was too tired to keep it closed. By the end of the week, he had already visited several damaged ranches. He offered money, quick money, enough to pay debts, enough to leave before the next winter. To some, it sounded like kindness. To others, it sounded like surrender. At Whispering Pines Ranch, Tom heard the news from Sam. They were repairing a section of fence near the eastern pasture. Langley bought the Miller place. Tom stopped hammering. "The Millers sold?" Sam nodded. Had no choice. Their barn was gone. They couldn't afford repairs. Tom looked toward the mountains. "How much did he pay?" Sam shook his head. "Not enough." Neither man spoke. They both understood. Land rarely changed hands because someone wanted to leave. Most times, it changed because someone had no other option. That evening, Nora sat at the kitchen table with a stack of receipts. The room was warm. The storm damage outside was still visible through the window, but inside, life had begun returning. A pot of coffee sat beside her. The fire cracked softly. Tom entered carrying a folded newspaper. She looked up. "Something wrong?" Tom placed it on the table. "Victor Langley is buying damaged ranches." Nora unfolded this paper. There was a small advertisement: land purchases, fair prices, immediate payment. She read it carefully. Then she looked at Tom. "Where?" He named 3 ranches. Nora's eyes narrowed slightly. Not fear, not surprise. Recognition, Tom noticed. "What?" Tapped the paper. "He isn't buying random land." Tom leaned closer. "What do you mean?" She reached for the valley map. It was the same map she had studied during the storm. She placed her finger on the first ranch, then the second, then the third. Tom watched as the pieces came together. They all sit near the same water routes. Nora nodded. Spring runoff from the mountains feeds those areas. Tom looked at the map. "He's not buying damaged ranches." "No." Her voice was quiet. "He's buying access." The room became still. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Tom looked at the names marked on the map. A man who owned enough land could control where cattle moved, where crops grew, where families survived, and Victor Langley understood that. Tom leaned back. "How did you see this?" Nora looked down at the papers. "Because I always look at what happens next." The answer stayed with him, because that was exactly what she had done during the storm. She had not only seen the snow, she had seen what the snow would cause. The next morning, Tom rode into Redstone. Nora went with him, not behind him, beside him. The difference was small, but everyone noticed. At the general store, people greeted Tom first. That was normal, but then they looked toward Nora. Miss Whitman, a rancher named Peter Collins, removed his hat. "We heard Whispering Pines made it through because of you." Nora gave a small nod. "We were fortunate." Peter smiled. "Fortune helps people who prepare." Tom watched the exchange. Months earlier, Nora would have stood near the wall, quiet, invisible. Now people came to her. They asked questions. They wanted answers. At the far end of town, Victor Langley stepped out of the bank. He saw them. His eyes moved from Tom to Nora. A brief pause, then he walked over. "Mr. Callahan." Tom turned. "Langley." Victor smiled politely. "I've heard your ranch survived the storm." "We did." "Good." Victor looked at Nora. "And this must be the woman everyone's talking about." Nora remained calm. "Eleanor Whitman." Victor nodded. "A pleasure." But something about his tone felt empty, like he was examining a piece of equipment, not meeting a person. "I understand you have strong opinions about ranch operations." Tom's expression changed slightly, Nora noticed. Victor continued. "Nothing wrong with that. Everyone has their place." The words were carefully chosen, polite, almost friendly, but Nora heard what was underneath. Tom did too. Before he could answer, Nora simply folded the map in her hands. "We all have a place, Mr. Langley," Victor smiled. "Of course." Then he tipped his hat and walked away. But Tom watched him leave. "He knows about you." Nora looked at the banker's door, closing behind him. "He knows enough to be careful." That evening, Tom and Nora returned to Whispering Pines. The ranch was quiet. The same mountains surrounded them. The same fences needed repair. The same cattle needed tending. But now there was another battle, one that would not arrive with wind and snow, one that would come dressed in a fine coat and carrying documents. Later that night, Tom found Nora at the kitchen table again, the same place where she had spent years counting supplies and writing notes nobody asked to see. He placed a fresh cup of coffee beside her. She looked at it, then at him. "You don't have to do that." Tom sat down. "I know." A small silence passed. Then Nora smiled faintly. The storm had taught them how to survive. But Victor Langley was about to teach them something else. How much a person was willing to fight for what they loved. And this time, Whispering Pines Ranch would not be fighting a storm. It would be fighting a man who believed everything had a price. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the San Juan Mountains. The snow remained along the higher slopes, bright beneath the morning sun. But the roads through Redstone Valley began to clear. Wagon wheels returned to the muddy trails. Ranch hands repaired fences one post at a time. Smoke rose from chimneys again, as families worked to rebuild what the blizzard had taken. But the damage was still there. Everywhere Tom Callahan rode, he saw reminders: a collapsed barn leaning against the wind, a broken gate hanging from one hinge, fields covered with branches and ice. The storm had passed, but the valley was still trying to find its footing. And in the middle of it all was Victor Langley. His name appeared more often with every passing week. Another ranch purchased, another family leaving, another piece of the valley changing hands. Tom hated the feeling that came with it. Not fear, something worse, the feeling that someone was quietly winning while everyone else was still trying to stand. One morning, Tom walked into the kitchen at Whispering Pines and found Nora studying a map spread across the table. Sunlight came through the window, falling across the papers and the wooden surface worn smooth from years of use. She had a pencil in one hand and a cup of coffee beside her. Tom leaned against the doorway. "You've been awake long?" Nora looked up. "Long enough." He smiled slightly. That answer usually means too long. She looked back at the map. 3 more families are considering selling. Tom stepped closer. "How do you know?" "I spoke with Mrs. Miller yesterday." "The Millers?" Nora nodded. "They're worried about repairs before spring. Their roof damage is worse than they thought." Tom looked at the marks on the map. "What are you doing?" Nora moved the pencil, looking at what connects them. Tom studied the map. For years, Tom had looked at land differently. He saw grazing areas, fence lines, cattle paths, places where a ranch could grow. Nora saw something else. She saw people. She saw where families depended on each other. She saw where one problem could spread. "The families near Black Creek," she said, "share access to the same water source." Tom nodded. "Yes, and the Collins Ranch uses that same route for cattle movement." "Yes." She tapped another location. "If Langley owns these 3 areas, he controls the easiest path between several ranches." Tom was quiet. Because she was right. Again, he isn't just collecting land. Nora shook her head. "No." She looked out the window toward the mountains. "He's collecting influence." Tom looked at her. A year ago, he might have dismissed the thought. He might have said she was worrying too much. Now he listened, because he had learned the cost of not listening. "We need to talk to the others," Tom said. Nora looked surprised. "About what? About what you've seen?" A small pause. "You want me to explain it?" Tom nodded. "I want them to hear it from you." The words were simple, but Nora noticed. She always noticed. Because Tom was not asking her to stand behind him. He was asking her to stand beside him. That afternoon, they rode across the valley. The trail was still rough from winter. Mud covered the lower roads, and their horses moved carefully over the uneven ground. Tom rode beside Nora, not ahead. Beside. At the first ranch, an older farmer named George Miller met them near the barn. He looked tired, not weak, just tired in the way a person looked after carrying too much for too long. Tom removed his hat. "George." George nodded. "Tom." His eyes moved toward Nora and Miss Whitman. Nora smiled. "How is your wife?" "Better. Thank you for asking." They talked about repairs first, the roof, the fence, the cattle. Then Tom looked toward Nora. She stepped forward. "The water line near your lower field." George frowned. "What about it? Has anyone offered to buy that section?" The old rancher became still. "How did you know?" Nora glanced at Tom, then back at George, "because it's the same thing happening everywhere." George removed his hat and rubbed his forehead. "They said they were helping." Nora looked at the broken barn behind him. Sometimes help comes with a bill nobody sees until it's too late. Nobody spoke for a moment. It was not a dramatic speech. Nora did not need one. She simply told the truth. And people listened. By sunset, Tom and Nora had visited 3 ranches. At each one, the same pattern appeared. A damaged property, a desperate owner, a generous offer, and land positioned exactly where Langley needed it. On the ride home, Tom was quiet. The mountains turned orange in the fading light. Finally, he spoke. "You realize what happened today?" Nora looked over. "What?" "People trusted you." She looked ahead. They trusted the information. Tom shook his head. "No." He slowed his horse. "They trusted you." Nora did not answer. For a woman who had spent years being overlooked, praise still felt unfamiliar. Almost uncomfortable, Tom noticed. So he did not push. He simply rode beside her. The next week, Whispering Pines became a place people visited, not because they needed a meal, not because they needed shelter, because they needed advice. Ranchers stopped by with maps, letters, contracts, questions. Nora sat at the same kitchen table where she once prepared food in silence. Now she spread papers across it. She read documents carefully. She checked numbers. She noticed details others missed. One afternoon, Caleb walked in carrying a stack of papers. "I found these in the old supply room." Nora looked up. "What are they?" "Old purchase records." She opened the first page, then another. Her expression changed slightly. Tom noticed from across the room. "What is it?" Nora looked at the documents. "These aren't just recent purchases." She placed the papers on the table. "Langley has been studying this valley for years." Tom walked closer. The records showed land names, water rights, old agreements, plans that went back long before the storm. The blizzard had not created Langley's opportunity. It had only given him the opening he needed. Tom looked at Nora. "What do we do?" The question was different now. Not the question of a ranch owner asking an employee, the question of a man asking his partner. Nora looked around the kitchen, the same walls, the same stove, the same place where nobody once thought her voice mattered. Then she looked back at Tom. "We make sure people know what they're selling." Tom nodded. Outside, the ranch hands moved through the evening light. The sound of horses filled the yard. The smell of wood smoke drifted from the chimney. Life continued, but something had changed. The woman everyone once thought only knew how to cook had become the person helping the valley understand what was truly at stake. And for the first time, Tom Callahan was not leading the way. He was walking beside her. For several weeks after the blizzard, Whispering Pines Ranch became something it had never been before, a place where people came to ask. The kitchen door that once separated Nora Whitman from the rest of the ranch was still the same wooden door. The hinges still creaked. The paint was still faded from years of cold mountain air, but nobody walked past it anymore. Ranchers stopped there with questions. Neighbors brought documents. Families sat at Nora's table while she studied maps and explained what she had found. The same hands that once carried plates now turned pages of contracts and land records. And Tom noticed every bit of it. He noticed the way men who once spoke over her now waited for her answer. He noticed the way Nora still reached for the coffee pot before anyone else. He noticed the way she never acted like she had won anything. She was simply doing what she had always done, taking care of what mattered. But Victor Langley had noticed too, and he did not like losing control. One cold morning, a rider arrived at Whispering Pines carrying a sealed letter. Tom opened it beside the front office window. The paper was thick, the handwriting was neat, the message was polite. Too polite. "Mr. Callahan," Tom read aloud, "I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss a reasonable arrangement regarding your eastern pasture and surrounding access routes." Sam looked over his shoulder. "Reasonable arrangement." He laughed quietly. "That's a fine way of saying he wants something." Tom folded the letter. "He wants the land." Nora, standing near the desk, looked at the paper. "Not just the land." Tom looked at her. "The route." She nodded. "If he controls the eastern pasture, he controls movement between several ranches." Tom placed the letter down, and he knows it. That afternoon, Victor Langley arrived at Whispering Pines. He came in a black coat, riding a strong gray horse. No mud on his boots, no snow on his shoulders. He looked like a man who had traveled through the frontier without ever being touched by it. Tom met him near the ranch house. "Langley." Victor smiled. "Callahan." His eyes moved toward the buildings. "You've rebuilt quickly. We work hard." Victor glanced around. "Yes, I suppose you do." The way he said it made the compliment feel empty. Nora stepped outside. Victor tipped his hat. "Mrs. Whitman, Nora Whitman. He smiled. Of course, Tom noticed the correction. Small, but intentional. Victor looked toward the pasture. You have a valuable piece of land here. Tom crossed his arms. I know what I own, Victor smiled. Every man knows what he owns. The question is whether he knows what it's worth. Nora stood quietly beside Tom. Victor continued. Winter has been difficult. Many ranchers are realizing that independence is harder than they expected. Tom's expression tightened. Are you offering advice or making an offer? Victor gave a small laugh, both. He reached into his coat and removed a folder. I believe there is a practical future for this valley. Consolidation, better organization, shared resources. Nora looked at the folder. Shared by whom? Victor's smile faded slightly. Excuse me? She stepped closer. Who controls the decisions? The question was simple, but it landed heavily. Victor looked at her. Miss Whitman, business decisions are complicated. So are the consequences. For a moment, nobody spoke. The wind moved across the pasture. A gate creaked in the distance. Victor looked back at Tom. I understand you have allowed emotions to influence your judgment. Tom's eyes narrowed. Meaning? Victor glanced toward Nora. I mean that hardship often causes people to confuse loyalty with wisdom. The insult was hidden, carefully wrapped, but everyone heard it. Sam, standing near the barn, lowered his tools. Caleb stopped repairing a fence. Even the ranch hands who once ignored Nora understood what had just happened. Victor was not questioning a decision. He was questioning whether Nora belonged in the room. Tom took a step forward. Be careful, Langley. Victor looked at him. I meant no offense. Tom's voice remained calm. You came to my ranch, looked at the people who helped save it, and decided one of them didn't belong. Victor said nothing. Tom continued. You spent years studying land. He looked toward the ranch. You never studied the people standing on it. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Victor closed the folder. I see. He placed the papers back inside his coat. Then perhaps there is nothing more to discuss. He mounted his horse. Before leaving, he looked once more at Nora, not with anger, with calculation. That bothered Tom more, because anger was easy to understand. Calculation meant a person was already planning. After Victor disappeared down the road, nobody moved for a while. Then Caleb spoke. Did he really think she had nothing to do with this ranch? Sam looked at him. You used to think the same thing. Caleb looked down. I know. The answer was quiet, honest. Later that evening, Nora sat alone in the kitchen. The fire burned low. A stack of documents rested beside her. Tom entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside her. She looked at it. You've been doing that often. What? Bringing me coffee. Tom sat across from her. Maybe I'm trying to make up for years when I didn't. Nora looked down. The room became quiet. Finally, she said, You don't have to prove anything to me. Tom nodded. I know, a pause, but I do have to prove something to myself. Nora looked up. Tom rested his hands on the table. For years, I thought being a leader meant having all the answers. He glanced toward the old records. The truth is, the best leaders know when someone else sees something they don't. Nora held his gaze. It lasted only a moment, but it said more than either of them wanted to admit. Outside, the ranch continued moving. Horses shifted in their stalls. The wind moved through the pine trees. Life carried on. But inside that small kitchen, something had changed. Tom was no longer trying to protect Nora because he thought she needed protection. He was standing beside her because he understood her worth. The next morning, a notice arrived from the county office. Victor Langley had filed paperwork claiming several disputed access routes across the valley. The same routes Nora had marked on her map, the same routes that connected dozens of ranches. Tom read the document twice, then he looked at Nora. She already knew. "What now?" he asked. Nora folded the notice carefully. "Now we show them the truth." Tom nodded, because this time, he was not asking what he should do. He was asking what they should do together, and across the valley, Victor Langley was preparing his next move. He had won land before, he had bought silence before, but he had never faced a woman who remembered every detail everyone else forgot. For the first time in years, Victor Langley found himself facing something he could not simply purchase. He could buy damaged ranches, he could buy tired men's signatures, he could place contracts on wooden desks and convince people that giving up was the only sensible choice. But he could not buy the truth, and Eleanor Whitman had spent her entire life collecting it. The days that followed were filled with movement. Letters traveled across the valley. Ranchers rode from one property to another. Old records were pulled from dusty shelves. Men who had spent years working separately began sitting together, and every road seemed to lead back to Whispering Pines Ranch. Not because Tom Callahan owned the biggest ranch, not because he was the loudest voice, because Nora had created a place where people felt they could be heard. The kitchen became the center of everything. The same kitchen where she had once stood alone before sunrise, the same room where she had prepared meals while men discussed cattle prices and weather conditions without asking her opinion. Now the table was covered with maps, letters, receipts, land records, coffee cups. People came through that door carrying worries they had never shared before. One afternoon, George Miller sat across from Nora with a folded document in his hands. "I almost signed it." Nora looked at him. "The agreement?" He nodded. "I thought I had no choice." Tom stood near the fireplace, listening. George unfolded the paper. Langley made it sound like he was doing me a favor. Nora carefully read the document. Her finger stopped near the bottom. "This section." George leaned forward. "What about it? If you sell this access route, you lose the right to use the water crossing after 3 years." George stared at the page. "I didn't see that. Most people don't." Her voice was calm. "That's why they write it that way." The old rancher sat back slowly. The room remained quiet, not because anyone was surprised, because they were beginning to understand. Victor Langley had not been counting on people being foolish. He had been counting on people being tired. That was different, and it was dangerous. By the end of that week, the ranchers of Redstone Valley gathered at Whispering Pines. The meeting was held in the dining room, the same room where cowboys once ate quickly before returning to the fields. Now every chair was filled. Men and women sat shoulder to shoulder. Neighbors who had barely spoken before the storm shared stories of what they had lost. Tom stood at the head of that table. For a moment, everyone expected him to speak first. Instead, he looked toward Nora. She stood beside the old map hanging on the wall. She should explain. A murmur moved through the room, not confusion, recognition. Nora stepped forward. She placed her hands on the table. "I know some of you wonder why a ranch cook is standing here talking about land agreements. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted." She continued. "I spent years keeping records. Not because anyone asked me to, because someone needed to remember." She touched the map. Every ranch in this valley depends on another. Water, roads, supply routes, shared pasture. She looked around the room. That is what Langley understands. He knows this valley is connected. A pause. He is counting on us forgetting that. The room stayed silent. Then George Miller spoke. "She's right." One voice, then another, then another. People began pointing out problems they had noticed, questions they had ignored, offers they had received, patterns they had missed. And slowly, the room changed. It was no longer a meeting about losing land. It was a meeting about protecting a home. Tom watched Nora as she moved through their discussion. She did not demand attention. She did not fight for the spotlight. She simply answered each question carefully, exactly as she had always done. The difference was that now people were listening. Later that evening, after everyone had left, Nora remained at the table. The room was quiet again. The candles were nearly burned down. Tom walked in carrying a small wooden box. She looked up. "What is that?" He placed it on the table. Inside was a brass key. Nora frowned. "Tom?" He took a breath. "This is for the ranch office." She looked at him. "The office?" He nodded. "I want you to have full access." Nora looked at the key, but did not pick it up. "Tom, I already help with that records." "I know." He paused. "But helping isn't what I'm asking." The words settled between them. "I want you to be my partner." Nora looked away. The room became very still. Tom continued, "Not because the ranch needs saving." He stepped closer. "Not because you know more than me." A small smile appeared. "Although you do." That brought the faintest smile from her. Then he became serious again. "I want you beside me because this ranch is better when you are." Nora looked down at the key. For years, she had held responsibility without authority. She had carried burdens without recognition. Now, someone was finally offering her a place at the table, not a seat in the corner, not a role behind the scenes, a place beside him. Before she could answer, the kitchen door opened. Caleb stepped inside holding a stack of papers. "I found something." Tom turned. "What?" Caleb walked to the table. "Old county records, from before Langley started buying land." Nora opened the folder. Inside were copies of earlier property agreements. She read through them carefully, then her eyes lifted. "This changes things." Tom moved closer. "What is it?" Nora pointed to a section. These access routes were never owned by individual ranchers. She looked around the room. They were shared agreements. George Miller, who had returned for his forgotten coat, stepped closer. "So Langley can't claim them, not without challenging every agreement." Tom looked at the documents. A quiet hope entered the room. Not a promise, not yet, but a chance. The next morning, the ranch gathered again, this time not to discuss what they might lose, to discuss what they would protect. And when the meeting ended, nobody left through the kitchen door without thanking Nora. Some shook her hand, some simply nodded, some had no words, but every person who walked away understood the same thing. The woman they once asked to fill their plates had spent years keeping their lives from falling apart. That evening, Tom found Nora standing beside the kitchen door. The old wooden frame still carried scratches from years of use. He stood beside her. "This door has seen a lot." Nora smiled softly. "It has." Tom looked into the dining room. "Funny." "What is? All these years, you stood here watching everyone else sit at the table." Nora looked at him. "And now?" Tom held her gaze. "Now I think the table was waiting for you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the mountains stood quiet beneath the evening sky. The storm was gone, the fight was not over, but for the first time, Whispering Pines Ranch was not a place where Nora Whitman worked. It was a place where she belonged. Spring came slowly to the San Juan Mountains. The snow that had once buried the roads melted into clear streams that ran beside the fields. The frozen ground softened beneath the morning sun. Wild grass began pushing through the earth again, and the sound of cattle moving across open pasture returned to Whispering Pines Ranch. Months had passed since the blizzard. Months since the night when everyone inside the ranch had depended on the woman they barely noticed. And yet, some things remained the same. The kitchen door still creaked when it opened. The old wooden table still carried scratches from years of use. The coffee pot still sat near the stove every morning, but Nora Whitman was no longer standing behind that door waiting for someone to need her. She walked through it because she chose to. The ranch office had changed too. Her brass key now hung beside Tom's. 2 desks sat near the window. 2 sets of records filled the shelves. 2 people made decisions, not one leading, not one following, together. Tom Callahan learned quickly that partnership meant more than sharing responsibilities. It meant listening. It meant asking questions before making choices. It meant understanding that the quietest person in the room might be the one who noticed the most. One morning, Tom stood beside the corral watching Nora review a shipment record. "You found something wrong?" She looked up. "The feed order." He walked closer. "What about it? The supplier charged us for 50 extra sacks." Tom took the paper. He looked at the numbers, then he smiled. "You caught it." Nora raised an eyebrow. "You sound surprised." Tom laughed softly. "I am surprised." She gave him a look. He quickly corrected himself. "Not because I doubt you." A small silence. "Because I still forget how long you've been doing this." That was the difference. Before, he would have said he never knew. Now he admitted that he should have. Nora folded the paper. "You are learning." Tom smiled. Slowly. Slowly is still learning. Across the valley, the fight with Victor Langley ended quietly. Not with a dramatic confrontation. Not with shouting. With documents, records, and people who finally refused to be divided. The shared access agreements Nora discovered were enough to challenge Langley's claims. Ranchers who once believed they had no choice began standing together. One by one, the easy deals disappeared. The land he expected to collect remained in the hands of the families who had worked it for generations. Victor eventually left Redstone Valley. Some said he found another place where people were more desperate. Others said he simply realized this valley was no longer easy to control. But at Whispering Pines, nobody spent much time talking about him, because the ranch had moved forward, and so had the people. On a warm afternoon, the community gathered at Whispering Pines for a spring supper. The long dining table sat outside beneath the open sky. More chairs had been added, more plates, more stories. Nora looked at the table for a moment. Months earlier, she had stood in this same place wondering if anyone would ever see beyond the work she did. Now children ran between the chairs, neighbors brought food, ranchers laughed together. The woman who once ate after everyone else now sat among them. Tom noticed her looking around. "You all right?" Nora nodded. "Yes." He followed her eyes. "It's different." She smiled. "It is." A breeze moved through the trees. The mountains stood beyond the ranch, quiet and steady. Tom looked toward the table. I was wrong about a lot of things." Nora looked at him. "You don't have to keep apologizing. I know." He paused. "But some things deserve to be said more than once." She waited. Tom lowered his voice. "I spent years thinking I needed someone who could follow me." The sounds of the gathering continued around them. The laughter, the voices, the clinking of dishes. Then he looked at her. "I was wrong." Nora stayed quiet. "I needed someone who could stand beside me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nora looked down at her hands. Hands that had cooked thousands of meals. Hands that had repaired things nobody noticed. Hands that had carried responsibility without recognition. Tom gently placed his hand over hers, not to rescue her, not to save her, just to remind her that she was no longer carrying everything alone. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Nora returned to the kitchen. The fire had burned low. The room was quiet. She touched the old wooden doorframe, the same place where she had stood for years, the same place where she had watched others enter and leave. Tom appeared behind her. You remember this spot? Nora smiled. How could I forget? He looked around. You know, I used to think this kitchen was just where meals were made. She looked at him. And now, Tom glanced toward the table. Now I think this is where this ranch was held together. Nora looked through the doorway. The dining room was empty, but it no longer felt lonely. She had spent years believing being needed was the same as being valued. The storm had taught everyone something different. The person who quietly carries the weight of a place is often the one holding it together. Years later, people would still tell stories about the Great Blizzard of 1887. They would talk about the snow, the cold, the ranches that struggled, the families that survived. But at Whispering Pines, the story they remembered most was not about the storm. It was about the woman who saw it coming, the woman who prepared, the woman who kept caring even when nobody was watching, and the cowboy who finally understood that the greatest strength on his ranch had never been found in the size of his herd, the land he owned, or the reputation he carried. It had been standing quietly behind a kitchen door all along. Eleanor Whitman was never just the cook. She was the heart of Whispering Pines, and once they finally saw her, they never looked away again. Imagine standing where Nora stood, behind a kitchen door, giving your best years to a place that rarely stopped to ask who you truly were. Imagine carrying wisdom, kindness, and courage quietly, while others only noticed the work your hands could do. Then imagine the moment when the people around you finally understood that the person they overlooked was the very one who held them together. Nora's story reminds us that worth is never measured by titles, appearances, or how loudly someone demands to be seen. Sometimes the strongest hearts are the ones that keep showing up, keep caring, and keep believing in the people around them even through the hardest seasons. And maybe that is the quiet lesson Whispering Pines left behind. Love is not about finding someone perfect. It is about recognizing the person who has been standing beside you all along. It is about second chances, gratitude, and having the courage to truly see another soul. If Nora's journey touched your heart, share your thoughts with us in the comments. Tell us what moment in her story meant the most to you. And if you enjoy stories of love, healing, mystery, and the strength of the human spirit, we invite you to subscribe. Many more unforgettable stories are waiting for you in the videos ahead.